And I hope you guys find this informative. And we're going to be fairly informal. Now the plan is to have it go for about an hour. But if you guys have a bunch of questions and we will stand here and talk and ask questions, that's fine. I'm good for as long as anybody needs to talk about this afternoon. For those I haven't met or don't know, my name is Jason Connelly. I'm a family physician. Our practice is over in Cleveland. And Mickey came up with the idea about having a seminar on dementia. And so this is our first in that series of those seminars. And right now we're planning for 3, and we'll go to 4 if we need to. And so today we're just going to talk about some very basics. We're not going to get real in-depth about anything, but I am going to address some of them just more common things about dementia. And then on our next one, we'll talk more in-depth about things such as treatment and caring for those with dementia. And then we are also planning a seminar that talks about more of the financial and legal aspects of caring for folks with dementia, because that tends to be a very big issue. And then caregiver support, right? That's the biggest one. So I am so glad everyone is here this afternoon. And before we get started, the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let's say a prayer. Heavenly Father, as we come together this afternoon, be here with us. We know that your Spirit is always guiding us. And Lord, we just thank you so much for the time to be able to spend together and talk about such an important subject. Lord, help us as we go through our weeks and we care for each other, and keep us in the love that you have shown the world. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right. We're going to start out with a simple definition. I think it's always important, so we all know exactly what we're talking about, that we all have a clear understanding of what dementia is and what dementia isn't. Now, just by a show of hands, how many of you have ever forgotten where you laid your keys? How many of you have ever forgotten somebody's name only to remember it 10 minutes later? That is not dementia. Okay? I'm going to settle that score right now. That is not dementia. So for every single one of you that are, as we're going through this, going, oh my gosh, I've got some of that stuff. Take a deep breath. It's okay. We all forget little things. Okay? I can't say that enough. We all forget little things. And where we laid keys, where we set our glasses down, oh my gosh, I just got that cup of tea, and why is it still in the refrigerator? You know, that happens to everyone. Okay? So, definition of dementia is that it is truly a memory disorder. And it is usually characterized by gradual decline in cognitive functions and complex memory things. Okay, we'll just put it in a bucket of things, if you will. Now, DSM-5 is, for anybody who's ever had any sort of depression, anxiety diagnosis, the DSM-5 is what gives us that criteria for making those diagnoses. It has a very, very broad definition of dementia, and it's only in one domain. And we're going to talk about those cognitive domains next. And those cognitive domains include things like learning, complex activities, memory is part of that, language is part of that, executive functions, so calculations, just doing normal math is part of that. And then perceptual motor, so how you perceive the world and motor skills. And then a big one is social, okay? How you interact with others. I think we've all probably had friends, family, somebody we've known that when dementia sets in, we see a change in their behavior and how they interact with the world around them. Somebody who's very social becomes quite reclusive. Somebody, well, my grandmother was one of these, never spoke a curse word in her life. All of a sudden cursed everyone. She really did. But it's got to be a decline from where you start. So if you start on the lower end, it's got to move down from there. And it's got to interfere with your everyday function. So this is not something that is just a one-day kind of thing or a once-in-a-while kind of thing. It's an everyday issue for folks with dementia. So it's important when you go to your physician and you say, I'm worried about this person and having memory issues, or I think I may have memory issues, that we talk about where did you start from. So what is your cognition like to begin with? It's very different, right, for a college professor versus a blue-collar worker who never graduated high school. So what's that baseline function? Where do we start? And then there are stages. Mild cognitive impairment is kind of an in-between stage, and we'll talk about what that actually is. And then there's actually dementia that sets in. So what are some of the signs? Now here's where I said every single one of you, because I've got some of that, right? Number one, sleep disturbance. In fact, some studies indicate that sleep disturbances early in life can be indicative of developing dementia later in life. Doesn't mean it will, it just means that it might. The inability to retain new information, and I think that's what most people think about when they think about dementia, right? That short-term memory loss. You tell them, oh, well, I set that on the counter, and before they can go from one room to the other, they can't remember where they set that item or that object. Handling complex tasks. So this is like following multiple steps. And this can even include things like remembering how to shave. I've got to turn on the water. I want to heat that up. I want to mix up my soap. I want to put it on my face. I need to get the razor right. Those are complex tasks. And later in dementia, some of these folks can't even remember the tasks. They get them backwards or get them out of sequence or simply don't even know that they've got the razor backwards. Loss of reasoning. And this is a big one. So we're going to come back to this in a little bit when we talk about interacting with folks who have dementia. And then that ability to just maintain orientation. Where am I? What day of the week is it? And in some of these instances, it's even that inability to find their way home or find their way to somewhere they have always been. And then changes in behavior. We've already talked about that a little bit, but that can be quite significant. All right. So you go to your doctor, and you say, I want to be screened for dementia. How many of you has gone through a dementia screen?
I went through it with my husband.
Yeah. So, routine screening isn't recommended. There's never been a study that looked at routine screening that actually made a big difference in the outcome of dementia for the patient. And in medicine, one of the things we don't want to do is we don't want to do anything that, number one, doesn't add benefit or may cause harm. So one of the harms, if I had somebody come up here and we did a dementia test, and what if you didn't score perfect? How would that feel? Right? Maybe it was a bad day. Maybe you didn't sleep well the night before. Maybe your mind is on 50 million other things and it's worried about your family member who's sick in the hospital. So the tests aren't perfect. Now, with that said, Medicare, if you go through a Medicare annual wellness visit, actually requires us as physicians to at least ask about memory and cognition and concentration. Do you have concerns? At that point, then we go through the process of doing a little more formal assessment. So, number one, every single person who is being considered for dementia should be screened for depression. It is one of the major causes of lack of concentration, changes in mood, changes in sleep, changes in behavior and agitation and forgetfulness. And it often goes undiagnosed in early stages. And depression can actually mimic dementia. But depression is treatable, right? We can do something about depression at a much better rate than we can with dementia. And so a lot of those different areas you see here, like that socialization, and then the concentration and the memory deficits, didn't we just talk about those things with dementia as being part of those domains? So there are three main tests that in family medicine or in primary care you're going to see. And they're going to be the Mini-Cog-6, which is just 6 simple questions. You may also see something called the clock drawing test. I don't know how many of you are on Medicare Advantage plans, and when they come out and they do their assessment and they want you to draw a clock and put the numbers on it. That's called a clock drawing test. And then there's the Mini Mental Status Exam and the MoCA, which was developed out of Montreal. Now the MoCA is by far the best screener, if you will. And we're going to talk a little bit about what makes a good screener. So in medicine, have you ever wondered why doctors would do certain things and not others? Even though you heard it on TV or you read about it on Facebook or you got a pamphlet from the AARP or wherever. And it all boils down to 2 very simple topics. One is sensitivity. How good is that test at ruling out a problem? Those are screening tests, okay? Every screening test you do has a very high sensitivity, which means it's got a very low false negative rate. So if you're negative, you don't have the problem. Now the problem with screening tests, right? It says nothing about the positivity rate. So if you're positive, does that mean you have it? Well, in these tests, not necessarily. That goes to something called specificity, and that's where the other set of testing comes in. That's where we get into making the diagnosis, because it's much more specific. Now, these screeners actually do pretty good as far as screening is concerned. The only one that I know of as a screener that does a little bit better is actually for depression, the PHQ-9, which are 9 questions about how you feel and how life is being affected by your emotions. But 75 to 92%, that's not terrible. That's about the same as what you get with things like blood sugar tests. And then the 81 to 91% actually is pretty darn good for a test to be able to hold up to both of those levels, which is good. So you go in and you say, hey, I've got a little trouble with my memory. That's what your doctor is going to do. Okay? Now, have you ever taken a MoCA test? Montreal Cognitive Assessment. It is free online. Okay? If you wanted to, you can just go in and Google search MoCA, and there's a link there that says take the test. And you can take the test. Okay? Now, before I move on, the MoCA and MMSE are on a 30-point scale. Normal is 30. And that is normal for a 4th grade education. So, we're not screening on, say, somebody who went to school like I did. At this fourth grade education level, you should be able to score a 30 on a MOCA and an MMSE without any trouble. Other things that you'll notice that may be drawn or taken depending on history, risk factors, are some of these other tests, because so many times people feel like there should be a test for this, right? We should have a test for that. Because we're in 2023. We have a test for everything, right? So there are other things that you got to look for. So you got to look for thyroid disease because it can cause memory issues. It can cause weight loss, changes in behavior, and some other funkiness. B12 deficiency, which can lead to anemia, which can cause some of the symptoms, but it's corrected with replacement. Looking for that anemia with the blood count, and also our folate and iron levels, which are vitamin mineral levels that can affect that. Looking for simple stuff like kidney disease, liver disease, that may indicate that there's another issue that is actually causing the problem, and it's not a primary brain problem. And then syphilis testing. Now, this is rearing its ugly head yet again. Okay? In the 1940s, 1950s, into the 60s and 70s, syphilis had pretty high rates, and even into the 70s, we had fairly decent rates of neurosyphilis, which is what is called tertiary syphilis. So syphilis goes through 3 stages. It's sexually transmitted, so there is the lesion that occurs, which is the first sign. The second is a rash that can develop on the palms and on the feet. And then third is memory issues or brain issues that are affected by syphilis. And unfortunately, this is starting to overtake many of the other sexually transmitted diseases yet again, especially among our teenagers and young adults, which is sad, but it's still out there, so we still have to think about that. Now, imaging studies can help in some situations. They're not always required to make a diagnosis of dementia, but if somebody is going through stages of dementia where it's very rapid in decline, we may be thinking that this could be vascular, it could be another neurologic problem that we need to know about. If we see other abnormalities that may indicate problems, people who are at high risk for vascular disease, and we'll talk about some of those risk factors and how we take care of those. And then Lewy body disease, which is most commonly associated with Parkinson's disease, but can occur in other situations. And there are 3 basic exams that we do. We do a CAT scan or a CT scan. CAT scans can look at a fair amount of the brain and tell us whether or not you've had strokes or little mini strokes, or you got little blockages that are causing problems that could affect your memory. And then there's the MRI, which has a little better quality to it and can actually look for something called amyloid. And amyloid is very important because it's a protein that causes the brain problem that we see in Alzheimer's disease. And then there are PET and SPECT scans. Now, PET and SPECT scans, I've only ever ordered one in my career, and that was just a patient who we were concerned about Lewy body disease, but we had no other reason, so we needed to make a definitive diagnosis. So we ordered a SPECT scan. So it may get to that point, but it's often not necessary to go to that particular level unless there's just a question about what we're seeing. Referral. When do you refer? This is a challenge for us in primary care because we're trained on a broad amount of topics. And for the large majority of folks that we treat with dementia, we're well equipped to help take care of dementia. But there are times when we need the assistance of a specialist such as a neurologist, a neuropsychologist, a neuropsychiatrist, which is a little bit different, and then psychiatry and even neurosurgery, because there is one type of dementia that you need something done to the brain to take care of it. So, I put this in here just to say that it's often when the diagnosis is unclear or we can't seem to get a handle on some problem that the patient is having because it's just going beyond our level of training. But here are some of the less known reasons that people develop brain issues. And those are things such as normal pressure hydrocephalus, which is probably the most underdiagnosed neurologic problem out there. And this is a problem of the brain where there's too much fluid, and the pressure on the brain causes memory issues and passing out, along with vertigo. So those are the three common symptoms: vertigo, passing out, and memory problems. And it's easy to diagnose this once you get the imaging test, and then those people go through a lumbar puncture to measure the pressure, and just simply relieving the pressure relieves the problem. So that's where neurosurgery comes in to take care of those folks. Some of these other things are much more rare. So frontotemporal disease, corticobasal disease, also prion disease, also known as Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, which we went through that not too awful long ago, been about 10 years. We had some issues in Novant Health in the cleansing of surgical tools, and we had a couple of folks that actually developed CFD. And then traumatic brain injury, or it's also known as Breacher's syndrome. I don't know if anybody knows what that is. But that's people who have repetitive concussions. So we see this in football players. It's called Breacher's syndrome because it originally was defined by the VA for our servicemen and women who are coming back who were constantly around demolition and explosives because they had repetitive cognitive damage from concussions. So let's talk about some of the dementia syndromes and kind of what they are. So very first one, Alzheimer's. Okay? Alzheimer's is by far the most common dementia that is out there. And this is also, when you look at this one, this is where people talk about things like plaques and tangles, and we'll go into that in a second. But you see, by the World Health Organization, the estimate is well over 55 million people worldwide have Alzheimer's dementia. It's also much more common after age 65, but if it starts to develop before age 65, it tends to progress a lot faster and tends to be much more aggressive in nature. And it's also presumptive when we can't find another reason to explain the memory issues that the patient is having, because the true diagnosis of Alzheimer's dementia can only be had at autopsy, because you got to look at brain tissue. And nobody is going through brain biopsies to make the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. I don't know one. So we don't put people through that. So plaques and tangles. So this is, I want you to kind of think about a drop cord, this mic cord, right? So this connection right here is pretty good. You guys can hear me okay, right? So it's coming through the speakers. Well, in this instance, think of this kind of like the neuron in the brain, where you've got to have a signal go from one spot to the other to get where it needs to go to come out through the speakers. Well, in this problem, it's like somebody took this cord, cut it open, frayed all the little wires that are in there, and just bundled them together like this. So if I tried to do that, I don't think this mic would work, would it? And if we tried to do that with our electrical cords, we'd burn the building down because they'd spark and arc and create fire. Well, in the brain, what is happening is amyloid and tau protein, these are little proteins that develop in the brain, start to cause this scarring and these plaques and these tangles, and then all of a sudden, the neural connections don't work. The second problem is that we tend to produce an enzyme that breaks down the chemicals that helps bridge the gap. And that's called acetylcholine. So our brain then breaks it down too fast, we don't have it, and our connections, our electrical cords aren't working anymore. It's just not going across. So that's how I want you to kind of think about Alzheimer's disease. Now, a couple of numbers here, and the numbers are a little bit different, so we want to be careful about how we talk about them. So 4.2 people, 4.2 cases per 100,000 person years. So if you had 10,000 people who lived 10 years, 4.2 of those people will get Alzheimer's disease between the ages of 45 and 64. So that's actually fairly low. Okay. Now, 5 in 1,000 patients between the ages of 65 and 74 get it. Numbers are going up. And then over age 70, it's about 30 in 1,000. And then 60 to 80 when you hit 85 years of age. Part of this, science tells us, is just the aging of the brain and how this starts to develop, and our neurons aren't connecting the way, and we're losing some of that, and we've got some scar tissue that are there. But those numbers, that is pretty significant as we get older as an issue. Now, genetics does play a role, so there are some genetic predispositions. There are some genes that have been associated with Alzheimer's disease. And some folks may have gone through and had genetic testing done. You may have decided, well, I'm going to do one of these, 23andMe tests, right? And you come back and they say, oh, well, you have higher levels of this gene. Now, the question is, does that mean you're going to get Alzheimer's disease? And the science is not real clear on this because although it's autosomal dominant, and I'm going to show you one of those here in a second, but although it's autosomal dominant, only about 30% develop Alzheimer's disease. Some of that's because people get other problems and die before they develop Alzheimer's disease. And some of that is just the expression of the genes. Okay. Most everybody that knows my family knows about my hands. Okay? See my fingers? They're not normal. We're weird. Okay? This is a family trait. It's actually called type C brachydactyly. Both of my boys have it. Ryan's hands look like this, whereas Aiden's hands look like my left hand. It is an autosomal dominant gene, which means if you've got it, you've got it. But it's what is called incomplete penetrance. So Aiden's hands look like this because he got a very mild amount from a genetic. Ryan's hands look like this because he got a lot more from the genetic. Okay? Alzheimer's and these genes work the same way, and there are about 5 different genes that this is associated with. So if you ever do a genetic test and you decide to do one of those 23andMe, what I want you to hear is just because you have the gene doesn't mean you're going to get dementia. It means you're at higher risk, but it doesn't mean you're going to get it. Okay? And it's about 34% of dementia prior to age 65 is actually Alzheimer's disease. Okay? So about 65%, roughly, are other types and typically are due to other neurologic problems. Can anyone guess the most common cause of dementia before age 65? Alcohol disease. has to do with alcohol consumption and direct toxic effects of the alcohol on the brain. Most common reason of dementia before age 65. So let's switch up. Now let's talk about vascular dementia. Okay, so we've talked about Alzheimer's, now let's talk about vascular. In vascular disease, it's the little tiny capillaries in the brain that get blocked up. These are the smallest blood vessels, and as we get older, and if we've smoked and we had high blood pressure, and we had diabetes and high cholesterol, these little blood vessels are going to get blocked up, and you get enough blockage, it affects the brain's ability to remember. Now, the other way are what we call macrovascular problems, such as strokes, that can come from other issues, like a hole in the heart or atrial fibrillation, where you develop a blood clot that then goes to the brain, have a stroke, or the plaque in the brain itself burst open and you clot. But those folks have very rapid changes in memory for strokes, because you're going to see that immediately. Now, the most common associated problem is Alzheimer's disease. So yes, people could have both. They could have vascular changes but still have Alzheimer's. Again, you don't know that for certain, or I won't know that for certain until death, if you were to do a biopsy of the brain tissue and take a look at it. But in studies where they've actually done this, about 50% of the time, they've had comorbid issues. Now, it is thought that vascular disease contributes to up to almost 50% of dementia cases to some degree. And that really goes back to what we're going to talk about here in a little bit about prevention. How do we prevent this from occurring? So those risk factors, we've already talked a little bit about this. So as we get older, we do to develop hardening of the arteries and plaques in our blood vessels that can break open, and those little vessels get clogged up. If you have high blood pressure, diabetes, especially if it's not controlled, high cholesterol, if you're fairly sedentary, don't do a whole lot. Interestingly, people who weigh too little are just as at high risk as those that weigh too much. So you got to strike a balance. And that balance is a body mass index of somewhere between 21 and 30. You keep between 21 and 30, you're in the sweet spot when it comes to vascular disease. Smoking, of course, I think we all know what the risks of smoking are. And then things like heart disease and atrial fibrillation, which often are a problem because of some of these other risk factors. One of the more concerning forms of dementia when it happens, and this one is more concerning for caregivers and family members, is what's called Lewy body disease. Now, Lewy body disease is most often found in Parkinson's. So it's in about 70 to 80% of patients with Parkinson's disease. Rapid fluctuations in cognition. So these folks can go within the same day of not knowing who they are and where they are to being perfectly normal. They can also go from being happy to just being absolutely agitated in no time. So one of the biggest things that we look for Lewy body disease is actually hallucinations, especially visual hallucinations. So hallucinations actually are very rare in other types of dementia. But in Lewy body disease, it's actually very common, and it is the sign that says, hey, you need to think about Lewy body disease. And that's important because in treatment, it's very different depending on the types of dementia and what can actually happen with some of the medications that are used. Lewy body disease patients are much more susceptible to having adverse reactions to things like antidepressants and antipsychotic drugs. And then passing out, brief loss of consciousness, this can often occur in Lewy body disease. Autonomic nervous system problems, so there may be diarrhea or constipation, dry mouth, extra salivation, These folks tend to have blood pressures that just fluctuate extremely rapidly and wildly. They can also have sexual dysfunction, incontinence, or urinary issues that develop. And then these people do tend to sleep a lot, especially during the day. One of the other ones that is on there, it's kind of interesting, decreased sense of smell. COVID does that too, right? So it takes smell and taste away. Well, Lewy body disease takes smell away. And often these patients will lose a lot of weight because they stop eating, because about 80% of the taste of food is actually smell. It's not taste. So imagine if you couldn't smell anything. And if any of you have had COVID and lost your taste of smell and your taste, or sense of smell and sense of taste, it was hard to eat, right? Okay, treatment. I'm going to let this sink in just a moment. Number one treatment, and this is about avoiding, but it's also about treating patients with dementia. We've got to challenge our brains. If our brains just go into autopilot, dementia can set in, right? So if all we do is sit around all day long watching Fox News, that's not going to work. Plus, you're going to come see me because you're so anxious and nervous about what's going on in the world. Okay? Second one is exercise. Exercise increases the amount of oxygen going to the brain, and it fuels the brain, and the brain stays healthier and happier when we exercise. We've already talked about the sweet spot for weight, body mass index. Of course, avoiding cigarettes and alcohol. Now, what I will say is National Institute of Health guidelines say that for men, you can have up to 2 drinks a day, no more than 14 in a week, and a drink equivalent is no more than 1 ounce of liquor, 8 ounces of beer, or 4 ounces of wine. Or, I'm sorry, 12 ounces of beer, 4 ounces of wine. When you start to exceed those 2 drinks, you increase the risk of developing brain issues due to alcohol. For women, cut it in half. And it's simply because our bodies process alcohol differently. The amount of enzyme that we have in our livers to actually take care of alcohol is about 50% in women of what it is in men. So that's why you got to cut that in half. Natural foods. The brighter the color, the better the food. Bottom line, brighter the color, the better the food. So mix in those bright colored fruits and vegetables, and one of the healthiest are berries, especially blueberries. It's probably the food that is highest in antioxidants that is out there, but they are extremely healthy for us. And they are not problematic if you're diabetic. Okay? Some fruits are, right? Because they got a lot of sugar, but berries are not. And then control blood pressure, control diabetes, and control cholesterol. I can't say this enough. You've got to control all 3 of these. Okay? I think one of the most frustrating things for myself when I first started practice in family medicine was I'd have a patient come in and I'd put them on blood pressure medicine. They'd come back in a month and says, my blood pressure's better. Can I stop the medicine? Well, no, it's better. You got to stay on it. Or those diabetics who constantly are in the ups and downs because they can't seem to stay away from the ice cream and the cheer wine. Right? That's a problem. And then every single one of you, I know you know somebody that couldn't take cholesterol medicine for one reason or another. And you've read on Facebook and you've read online that statins are bad for you and that they're going to kill you, that they will create muscle and liver disease. Bottom line is, statins actually are some of the best preventative drugs we have out there for the development of cardiovascular disease. And actually in the studies show a decrease in dementia. Okay, I'm going to say that again. show a decrease in dementia, not an increase as what was spouted on Facebook about a year ago. Now, there are medications that we use, right? So if you have a family member who has dementia, they may be on one of these medications. We have 3 cholinesterase inhibitors. So Aricept, Exelon, and Razidine are those 3 drugs. Those are usually our go-tos, especially for those with Alzheimer's disease. Those are indicated even in mild disease, and we often will start when a patient shows up with mild cognitive impairment with Aricept. The most common side effect associated with these drugs, besides diarrhea, is abnormal dreaming. So they get some very vivid, upsetting dreams that can occur. But thankfully, it's fairly rare. Only about 5% of people are going to have either one of those issues. So 95% of people do just fine on them. Now, the problem is the expectation of what medications are going to do in dementia. Okay? And we're going to talk about that here in a minute. Namenda is another form that helps the brain. It can be added to these drugs. It's mostly used for moderate to severe disease and also in patients who have vascular dementia. It's been shown to have some benefit. Aricept and its cousins really not so much. And then recently there's been a monoclonal antibody, Aducanumab, and this antibody treatment really should only be used in patients who have changes on MRIs that show significant amyloid deposits. It's something called ARIA, A-R-I-A. So they get an MRI and the radiologist says, oh yeah, there's amyloid everywhere. That's when this drug is used. They've tried it in patients with very mild disease because the thinking is if we can prevent the amyloid, we can prevent the dementia. It just didn't work that way. So there's more to it than what we understand as of yet. But in severe disease or amyloid disease, it has shown benefit. Okay, supplements. Here are the safe ones. We're going to go into the ones that don't work. Okay? All right. I am not against homeopathic treatments. I am not against supplements. But as a scientist, I want to see the evidence that they actually work. Right? I want to know that it's going to work. I don't want people out there spending hundreds of dollars on supplements that don't do one lick of good. So these are the things that actually do help. So there are 2 amino acids, acetyl L-carnitine called Alcar, and another one called ALA or alpha lipoic acid. They come in combination. You can buy them in GNC. You can buy them online on Amazon if you want to. But they have shown benefit in improving concentration. They don't slow dementia, but they do improve concentration. So when you're doing some rehab, working with the person, what you can often find is that they tend to do a little bit better with the amino acids on board. Fish oil, mostly for people who have risk for vascular disease. Doesn't work otherwise. It's not for Alzheimer's disease. But if people have, risk for getting the little mini strokes, fish oil can be beneficial, and it's not harmful except for the fish burps. That's the one problem. B vitamins, extremely safe. By the way, you take too many B vitamins, what happens to them? You urinate them out. Okay? But we've already talked about that. If you get it through natural foods, you don't need a supplement. So if you're eating the berries and the brightly colored vegetables and the fruits, you don't have to take a B vitamin supplement. You're going to get them there. And then vitamin E. Now this is an interesting one. So vitamin E, in multiple studies, actually shows that it may have some bad effects on the heart for those who are prone to heart trouble. But in higher dosages, in some folks with mild to moderate disease and no risk factors for heart trouble, vitamin E may provide some mild benefit. That's what came out of the study, some mild benefit. All right. The ones that don't work. Don't take ginkgo if you want to support your memory. It does zero good. It's been studied multiple times. It does not work. Okay? Any benefit? It's all up here. It's not real. It's what we call the placebo effect. Also, Prevagen, Neuriva, nootropics, which is another new one that you might start seeing commercials for, those actually do not work. They don't work. They're based on very limited science around the ingredients that are in them, and they're regulated by the USDA, which is what regulates your meat and your produce, not by the Food and Drug Administration. That's how they get away with this. And let's be honest, I don't know if you guys have priced Neuriva. It's $55 a month. That gets expensive for something that doesn't do you a lick of good. Okay? Now, one of the things that I think is least focused on is hearing loss. And I've shared with some, my father-in-law has dementia. He's in his 70s. I've been married to my wife now for 26 years. We've been together well over 27, almost 28 years. This man could not hear when I met him. He is a police officer, retired police officer, had hearing loss at a very young age, was stubborn and never wore hearing aids. And I know that has contributed to a large amount of his dementia. And part of that is because people who can't hear become socially isolated. It's very difficult to interact with other people in your world if you can't hear what's going on or if you can't see what's going on. So treating these things is extremely important. And I think the biggest encouragement I can give anybody who's dealing with somebody with dementia is if they have hearing problems, yes, hearing aids are worth it. Okay? There's a new company that just released some brand new digital hearing aids at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas 2 weeks ago. It's called HP Nouhera, Nouhera. They are selling digital hearing aids for $800 a pair. And I don't know how many people have priced hearing aids lately. You go to the audiologist, you'll spend well over $6,000 for a pair of hearing aids. The other big things are, like we talked about, keeping the brain active, so keeping them in a program where their brain is stimulated, exercising, going just for that walk every single day can help. Patients who have dementia should avoid alcohol at all costs. It's just not worth it. It creates a lot of problems. Creates sleep disturbances, can cause agitation, increase in memory loss, falls, injury. Also, we have to address safety issues. And this, I think, is one of the toughest things that I see for caregivers and family members is around safety. Number one tough conversation you're ever going to have is you shouldn't be driving anymore. Right? Take away that independence, they're not going to like it. But let's be honest. We don't want them pulling out in front of somebody because they forgot that that car was coming or having an accident. I had a patient end up in an ER 2 states away, and they called us to see what her diagnoses were because she didn't know where she was. She just got on the interstate, forgot where she was going, and ended up in Georgia. Family was, beside themselves. Polypharmacy, so a lot of patients as we get older tend to be on a lot of different drugs. It is extremely important that you talk to your doctors that are treating your dementia patient about regularly reviewing your medication list and ask what could be affecting the brain in an abnormal way. Can we get rid of it? And then certain medications actually worsen problems. So things like benzodiazepines, these are anti-anxiety medicines, antihistamines, sleep aids. All of these actually worsen cognition and memory and can cause problems for patients who have dementia. Now, they may be necessary in other realms, but one of the biggest problems is the increase in just disorientation, which leads to falls and injury. So what do I expect? This is the best statement I can give everyone. Despite your absolute best efforts and the absolute best treatment for dementia, it is going to progress. As of right now, medical science has no cure for dementia. There is not a cure for dementia. We wish there were. Okay? We wish there were. Bottom line is, it's going to progress. So we have to plan ahead. So, to that point, begin planning early. As soon as that diagnosis is made, start the planning process. And like I said in one of our other seminars, we're going to have a lawyer come and speak on the financial healthcare power of attorney and how do you start making the end-of-life planning very early in this process. Discuss wishes and desires early on. You know, do you want to go to a nursing home? Do you want to stay at home? What is it that you want? You know, if it gets to the point where the medicines really aren't doing any good, do you want us to stop them? And the hardest part is about being that family and that caregiver is sometimes adhering to those wishes. I get it. It's difficult when that person is no longer making the decisions, and you are. But it is one of the most important gifts you can give them. And I just can't say it enough. Financial and healthcare power of attorney, get those things done early. Okay? Competency is often talked about in legal realms. Is that person competent? We'll often get asked that. Can you give me a letter to say whether or not my family member is competent? By the way, competency is not a medical diagnosis or term. It is not something we do or assess. That's not in our purview. We can't assess competence. I can give them the diagnosis. I can tell them the stage the patient is in. But competency is actually a legal determination that must be made by the court, not by the doctor. Okay? And then palliative care. So there may be some misunderstandings about the difference between palliative and hospice care, partly because I don't think people know enough about either one and kind of just lump them all together. Palliative care is really about comfort. It's about knowing that we can't cure the issue, but we can provide comfort to the patient. We can provide comfort to the family. We can provide support without being aggressively seeking a cure. That's what palliative care really is about. And then hospice care is that end-of-life care. So that's that person with memory troubles that has lost 60% of all function. And then they're more appropriate for hospice care. I've got 4 resources, and I've already talked to Pastor about this. One of the things we're going to do is after the talk, I'm actually going to put the web link in the slide instead of the names. This makes more sense this way than the web link, but I'm going to put the web link in the slides. And we're going to have those posted on St. Luke's website, available for folks who want to download the slides and look at that information. Also, we will make some hard copies available maybe in the narthex for next Sunday, so if you wanted to pick those up. But these are 4 very good organizations or 4 very good resources. The first one is Alzheimer's Association. They are a wonderful organization. They do a lot of good. They do a lot of research. They are one of the best fundraising organizations out there. We support Alzheimer's Association because Angie's family is riddled with Alzheimer's disease. The 36-Hour Day is actually a book that talks, and it's written for caregivers by caregivers. Okay? It talks about what to expect as a patient goes through dementia. It talks about how to interact with that person, right? It's so easy to say, I just told you that. That's one of the worst things we could say to a dementia patient. They can't remember. They don't know. They can't even reason at that point. The other big one is why. We've got to try and avoid the why did you, why, etc. You can add whatever you want to on the why. They're all about the here and now. Don't worry about the why. They don't even know the why. At that point, it made sense in their brain. Okay? Alzheimer's.gov is just another Alzheimer's website that you could go to. And then for those that are seeking assistance, there are 2 places in Rowan County that are excellent resources. One is Ruffey Homes and the Council on Aging. They have a lot of resources through the United Way that they can put you in touch with. They know about support groups. All you got to do is call out there. They have volunteers that are there. That is supported by United Way donations. Great organization. They can give you a lot of information. But one of the best services that we actually have is Lutheran Services of the Carolinas and the Adult Daycare Center at Trinity. And one of the things that caregivers actually need, they need respite. They need time away. They need time for their own health. And I tell a lot of caregivers this in the office. If you don't look yourself in the mirror and say, what do I need to do for me today? You are going to burn out as a caregiver. And that is not a selfish statement. Okay? You got to start with self-care, because if you aren't your best self, there's no way you could care for that person that needs all of the assistance that a dementia patient is going to need. You guys have paid a lot of attention to me. I've talked an awful lot. So I'm going to open up the floor to any questions that you guys may have. And we've got a microphone up here just so as you ask your questions, everybody can hear, or I can repeat them.
I just wanted to say the 36-hour day is a superly fantastic book. I had that dealing with Doc, and that book is it's well worth it.
Yeah, and it went out of print for a long time, the 36-hour day. There were only 2 copies at the Rowan Public Library, and they were always checked out. I always kept 3 copies at my office. I'm down to 1 because they haven't been returned. But it's now available on Amazon. Thank gosh for Amazon, right? So they brought back the 36-hour day, and you can order it through Amazon. It is well worth the read. It's written in very plain language as well, and helps with all of the different stages that folks are going to go through in caring for dementia.
I got a question. When you have surgery, like spinal surgery, can that cause issues with your memory?
So Mickey is wondering if surgery can cause problems with memory, and it's actually not the surgery itself, Mickey, that causes the problem. It's the anesthesia. So anytime we take a person who is having issues with their brain and we put them in an unfamiliar situation, or we stress their brain in some way, it's going to cause an issue. Now, thankfully for most folks, it is short term, unless there are complications or there's a prolonged stay. And then most of those people will decline to a new baseline. But it's not necessarily the surgery itself, it's the stress on the body and the anesthesia that creates the problem.
What about shock treatment?
They do not work. Shock treatments are only for severe depression.
Yeah, but would it cause Alzheimer's?
It does not necessarily cause Alzheimer's. It's a whole different process that is creating in the brain a problem. And one of the things is that they're not 100% sure whether it's direct damage or is it part of a severe depression that's being treated? And thankfully, we've gotten away from shock treatments for the most part. They are still in use today. Electroshock therapy, there's only one place in the Piedmont, and that's up at Wake Forest, that actually will do it. We now have better treatments through neurostims, vagal nerve stimulation, and then also what's called MRI of the brain. So they put the brain in an electromagnetic field to help with depression. So hopefully we can avoid some of those issues later on. Yes, sir.
How about the vitamins like Centrum Silver, and they have about 20 heavy metals in them. And
Yeah.
I've read an article, a medical group that were testing on Alzheimer's, and they took the plaque off, and they said there were like white pearls, I call them pearls, or beads, and they crushed them to see what was inside, and they said it was heavy metal. And that was quite a while ago.
Right.
And recently, they've just stated that the heavy metals in vitamins were banned because young children, there was a chemical in it or something that caused young children to have brain problems. So the question is, well, what I did to try and find out more is I called up on internet. I got into the manufacturers that made these metals for the instant breakfast and for the Centrum Silver for over 50 people. And it gave the size. I looked up first the size of the capillary, which was like 0.05 micron, and then I got the size dimension, the average dimension of the powders that are used for these heavy metals in there, and I found out like the average size 0.05 micron for the capillary, and the metals were up anywhere from 0.05 to 175 microns.
So there's
these
really
things would plug the hole.
Yeah, so we're talking about a multitude of things when we're talking about heavy metals, and there's a couple of things to really consider. So there are 3 heavy metals that are most problematic: lead, mercury, and cadmium. Okay, so we had some problems with cadmium in hip joints that were being released. Lead and mercury, typically environmental exposures. And every so often you hear about contamination of food supply, nutraceuticals, all of these things that are not regulated by the FDA. So those are the 3 heavy metals that create memory or brain dysfunction if they get into the system. They are not ingredients specifically for vitamin supplements, but they may be impurities that are found in some vitamin supplements, especially those that are coming out of China. Well, that's where a lot of this comes from. For those that are manufactured in other countries, it's not as big a deal. So we always caution folks when they say, well, can I buy drugs from, on the internet? Well, you got to know where your drug is coming from. Where is it manufactured is the big problem. And that's, you really want Canadian and American drugs. Europe is okay. You don't want anything from Southeast Asia, Mexico, South America, and especially not China.
These the ones that I found were United States.
Now,
and they had the patents on these things.
Now, they're in heavy metals. Iron is considered a heavy metal, right?
That was the worst, the biggest.
Manganese is a heavy metal. Now, the thing about those heavy metals and the size that are found in the powders versus what is the size of the capillary, you've got to separate those 2 things.
Yeah.
Partly because when the body receives that, it's broken down in the gut, the gut has to go to the elemental level to then transfer it into the bloodstream. So it's not about the size of the powder and that concentration. It's about the size of the molecule,
Yes.
which is not a problem. Because a red blood cell carries iron. You have to have iron to have a red blood cell. Okay? So iron is not a problem. Our body actually has protective mechanisms to move iron in to the places it's supposed to be. It does not create a problem. Neither does manganese, for those very reasons. But in general, why are supplements on every store shelf you go into? Why are they front and center in every pharmacy that you walk into?
Because it's high profit margin.
Yeah.
That is exactly right. It's money. It's money. It has nothing to do with benefit. It has nothing to do with real science. Because every time we study this, what is found is that a healthy diet trumps a supplement every single time.
Yeah, the same metal probably in a stalk of celery isn't going to be the same as what we would manufacture.
To some degree, that's
And
right.
Probably a whole lot smaller.
Now, the other thing that you mentioned is called NDMA, and that's a cancer-causing agent that was found it was found in the additives that were in a number of drugs. So things like Zantac, metformin, some blood pressure medicines. Even low levels of NDMA are actually removed by the FDA when it's found. You can't have any in our drug supply. But it is a chemical that is in almost all of our food supply because it's naturally occurring at much higher levels than were ever found in any drug that was sold by prescription. So that was another big thing when Zantac was pulled from the market. Oh my goodness, it has NDMA in it. Well, the level of NDMA was minute, but the FDA tolerates 0. That's the biggest thing.
Thank you. So this is basically to be safe by taking these vitamins.
You would be.
Minerals in.
You would be. And as we age, we actually slow down our ability to absorb things like iron. Our gut just can't absorb it because we don't have the transport molecules. B12 is another one that we have difficulty processing as human beings as we age. So getting a little more in the system can help us have more to build red blood cells and keep us healthy.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, sir.
My wife, she was just diagnosed with dementia about a month ago. They did a 3-hour test on her, and she got severe dementia. But the Lewy bodies, with Lewy bodies, do after a while, do they cause them not be able to talk or walk?
Yeah, so Lewy body disease. The gentleman was saying that a family member was recently diagnosed about a month ago with Lewy body disease. And in Lewy body disease, just because of the way that it affects the brain, it can get to that point. Most of these people at near the end of life look like they have very severe Parkinson's, even if they didn't have Parkinson's to begin with. Because of the area of the brain that is affected and the type of nerve tissue that is affected. And so a lot of folks with Lewy body disease, one of the things that start to be extremely problematic, besides things like the hallucinations that we mentioned earlier, is they can't even sit up because their blood pressure just falls. They sit up, they pass out. They stand up, they pass out. And it's all because of the nerve tissue that's affected by this. But there are medicines that can help with that, that can delay some of that progression. But it's an extremely difficult form of dementia. Like I said, because these folks can go from being almost normal to the wheels have fallen off.
She gets 65 years old.
And it will fluctuate back and forth, back and forth. And the other big one is just the agitation that goes along with that. Yes, ma'am.
So I have a question. Is the Lewy body often overlooked as a diagnosis? Does it take a long time to get that diagnosis?
It's
Does
not.
it mimic other stuff? Is that what it is?
So Lewy body disease is actually one of the easiest to diagnose with a SPECT or a PET scan. You just have to have a high index of suspicion. And as I mentioned, the number one thing that is recommended in medical books is that if hallucinations are present, consider Lewy body disease. You need to be evaluated for Lewy body disease if there are hallucinations present, because it's rare in most of the other situations.
You would call them, scream out at night and sleep, jerk and kick and stuff like that.
Sleep disturbance is actually the most common problem associated with Lewy body disease. Affects up to 90% of folks. And yes, so kicking, thrashing. There was a study actually that was part of the research that I did for this seminar that was talking about the fact that most patients in 20 years prior to their diagnosis of Lewy body disease, they are going to display some form of sleep or REM sleep disturbance, which could be like talking in the sleep, acting out in the sleep. You know, if they're punching someone in their sleep, they're punching, you know, they're actually punching. And that's a very common presentation, but it can precede the onset of the Lewy body disease by as much as 20 years.
Jason, in some of my reading, it was suggested, well, it has not been proven as of yet, but that inflammatory is one of the reasons for a lot of these diseases. What do you think?
So there, and
Inflammation.
Pam, what you're talking about are studies that actually show pro-inflammatory markers, right? So they measure these markers in the bloodstream and they follow these patients and then determine, well, this person had these markers, did they develop the issue? And there seems to be some correlation. Now, one of the second places that they took that study was to say, in those with markers, if we put them on anti-inflammatories, so if we put them on Celebrex, if we put them on ibuprofen or aspirin, or even Plaquenil, hydroxychloroquine, which can be used in inflammatory conditions, does it delay or does it prevent? And all of the studies have been inconsistent. There's no necessarily proven benefit, and the risk of the drugs so far has outweighed any benefit that was seen. So a lot of these folks got GI bleeds, had side effects from the medications, or had kidney issues that developed from the medications. So they're not typically prescribed unless there's another reason for the inflammation that you're treating.
I do not agree with taking prescription medication or over the counter. I have been taking Coumarin. What is your thoughts on that?
Okay. Turn this on. We can actually turn on the lights if we want to. So, there is a National Institute of Health for Complementary and Integrative Medicine. Okay? So this is the repository through the National Library of Medicine and also the Institute of Health that actually looks at studies that are done on what are called homeopathic or nutraceuticals. If you have questions about any nutraceutical. Does it work? What are the problems if I take it? What will it interact with? What are the side effects? You can go to this website, and there is a listing, A to Z, for any that have studies. Okay? That's where you will find information. Now, coumarin is okay, or curcumin, that's how it's sold, is okay for the large majority of people that take it. It does have some minor anti-inflammatory properties. Use it in cooking. Tastes pretty good too, right? Turmeric, that's what we're talking about, which is also known as curcumin or coumarin. But if you are on blood thinners, it is a no-no. If you are on blood thinners, fish oil is a no-no. Why? They have antiplatelet properties, and what that means is your blood cells that clot can no longer clot. So you bleed a lot more freely. If you take fish oil on blood thinners, that's a problem. If you take turmeric on blood thinners, other than what you might use in cooking, because you're not going to get that amount in cooking, but so you have to be cautious. Remember, 90% of the drugs that we use in traditional medicine came from plants. That's where they came from the natural world. 90%. What's the difference between the drugs I prescribe and the homeopathics that you might buy otherwise? It's purity. It's purity.
And what was that website?
So National Institute of Health, NIH, for complementary and integrative health. And I encourage any of my patients that want to start on a supplement, I say, go to that website, read up on it. Because if it has any benefit, it's going to say it has benefit. If it has side effects, it's going to tell you the side effects. It's going to tell you what to expect. And by the way, the side effect profile reads just like the side effect profile of every other drug I know. Headache, lightheadedness, dizziness, upset stomach, nausea, vomiting. Yeah, I don't care what you take. Every single one of them has that, right? Because those are the most common side effects of every single thing out there. And by the way, you drown if you drink too much water. And we're 75%, 80% water, depending on the day. Okay?
Are there times during the day when people are more confused if they have dementia? Like when Mama gets up, she's calling me Ashley, and she hasn't done that until since she's in the hospital. When she's woken up from sleep.
Yeah. So Cookie, you're asking about times of day, but I think you also, part of your statement there is important to understand as well. So time of day does matter. For most dementia patients, the best time of day to do anything is the first part of the day. Their brain is fresh. Okay? The longer the day goes, and the more work their brain has had to do to try and stay focused, the worse it gets. And by sundown, that's why we call it sundowners, things aren't working right. The brain's tired. It's used all of its energy stores. That's why for families dealing with dementia, when it comes to holidays, have your holiday gathering early, not late, because that person is not going to be able to do it later in the day. It's not going to work. The second part, though, is when we go from one brain state to another. So when we go from asleep to awake, I am not the most coherent person when I first wake up in the morning. It takes me 5 to 10 minutes just to get my bearings, to get my eyes open, get my brain going. As I get older, after after age 50, now I got to stand at the side of the bed for a moment before I walk away because I feel like I'm going to fall, you know. But for dementia patients, it's that much worse. It takes a lot longer for their brain to get in gear, if you will, to get the bearings, to understand where we are. And even in familiar places, it can be a challenge if there's a slight change. Okay? Move the coffee table, the world ends because you moved the coffee table. This isn't my house. My coffee table is here. It's not there. That's the sort of process their brain goes through. Take them out of their element. It's 5 to 7 days before things settle back down. It gets a lot worse for that period of time until they get used to their surroundings. So it can be extremely challenging, which is another problem for caregivers, right? That inability to go anywhere. Because that person, they don't want to travel. My father-in-law, he won't even leave the house anymore. Because even going to Walmart throws him off.
How many years has he been that way, Jason?
So Angie and I started trying to talk to the family about, I would say 12, 15 years ago, because we saw some issues. Now, my father-in-law, as a police officer, he worked in youth division. At his worst, he was smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day. He still smokes about a half a pack a day. It's a wonder the man is still alive just because of the number of cigarettes he's used in his lifetime. But about 10 to 12 years ago, we started noticing slight little changes in behavior, changes in sleep pattern. And, just having seen others go through this, we tried to talk to my mother-in-law and my brother-in-law and sister-in-law and say, look, we're seeing changes. Talk to the doctor about getting started on something. Deny. It wasn't until about 5 years ago that medicine was started.
So it's you're still calling it dementia, not Alzheimer's.
No, he has Alzheimer's. He has Alzheimer's. That's his problem. But he did not help himself alone either. Because smoking is a big one. It's a
What
big
are some,
problem.
you said, keep the brain challenged. What are
Yep.
some things that someone, like Mama used to do word puzzles, and now she picks it up, looks at it, and closes it, and doesn't do anymore. Is there anything that
So
happens?
So it all has to be determined by the stage that the person is in. Okay? In a normal, healthy brain games.
Yeah.
There's some online. There's a website called Lumosity. National Geographic has one called Brain Games that you can go to. There are video game platforms. There are cell phone apps that actually are developed specifically to stimulating the brain. So it looks like you're playing a game, but it's because it's activating certain parts of the brain. Playing cards with other people, playing games with other people, that's a great way to stimulate the brain. You're getting the social interaction and you're having to think, right? So those are big things early on. Now, as it progresses and you get to that more moderate stage, that person is going to want to try and withdraw. If you've already established that process, it's easier. If you haven't, you're probably not going to get them there. In the more severe stages, where that complex task, they can't even follow that, it's more about even doing things like singing. If they have a song that they will sing, singing together, having a conversation, can you tell me about when, kind of thing. And those sort of conversations really have to be about things that happened years ago. Can you tell me about when you were 16? Can you tell me about when you and your cousins got in trouble because you played in the mud and came home and got mud all over mama's floor. You know, that sort of stuff. Those are the sort of things that it engages a person. And even in severe dementia, I used to be the medical director at Alden Care in Salisbury, and one of the things we would do is we would sing Jesus Loves Me. Because most everybody knew Jesus loves me. And even the severely demented people would start humming along or singing some of the words as we sang Jesus Loved Me. So it was just, it was one of those things. And you could see them perk up just for that moment. But those are ways that you can help. Yes, sir.
Are we seeing more cases being determined as Alzheimer's or dementia as society progresses? 100 years ago, you never heard of this. Are we just now recognizing it, or is it spreading? Is it continuing to grow?
So, 100 years ago, what was life expectancy?
60, 50.
55. Thereabouts, right? We'll split the difference. We'll say life expectancy 100 years ago was 55. The largest majority of cases occur after age 65, right? So if you have a population that doesn't make it to 65, you're not going to see dementia. You're going to see very rare cases of it. The problem is our life expectancy, up until 2 years ago, had reached nearly 86, right? That is significant. That's great. That's wonderful. Now it's dropped to 85 because of heroin and fentanyl and overdoses, which is sad. But in a population that reaches older ages, you're going to have higher number of people. And the baby boomer generation, yes, you guys are a problem. Y'all know that? You're an issue. You're an issue for me and my generation because we are small. You guys are big. There's not enough of us to take care of all of you. But yes, in that respect, we are seeing many, many more cases because we're seeing people live to longer ages and they're not dying of those other things. We're saving folks from heart attacks and strokes and cancers. We're curing more and more cancers than ever before. So yes, we're seeing more cases. The overall rate's the same.
Is that because of the fentanyl and the heroin and the meth and these things that the children are doing these days?
That's why the life expectancy dropped. It has nothing to do with dementia, but it's why we have seen for the last 2 years a decline in the U.S. life expectancy. It's just because we've got too many young people dying of bad